Think about this as we think about reading the Bible with Jesus in focus. In Luke chapter 24, after Jesus has been resurrected, he's walking down the road or on a road outside of Jerusalem toward a village called Emmaus. And on that road are a couple of his followers. And those two followers, they don't recognize Jesus. The text actually goes out of its way to tell us that it was kept from them for recognizing Jesus. But what does happen is Jesus engages with them and starts to ask questions about what they're talking about. And what they happen to be talking about is Jesus' recent death, and which had transpired about 3 days prior to this conversation. And Jesus is asking these questions, and they're incredulous. They can't even believe he hasn't heard. It's such big news. And so Jesus, the Bible tells us, goes about teaching them why the Messiah, why the Christ needed to suffer. And in that passage, again, they don't know he's Jesus. They don't even know yet for sure that he's resurrected. All they know is that the ladies who visited the tomb are saying his body is missing, and they claim to have seen an angel who said he was resurrected, but they don't have the hope of the resurrection yet because they haven't seen the risen Christ. And so the risen Christ, well, they have seen the risen Christ, but they don't know it yet because he's there his identity is kept from them. It says these words in Luke 24:27, that Jesus, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them all the scriptures, the things concerning himself. From the law and prophets, Jesus showed them how it was always about him. This is how we're to read the Bible today. We're not merely to grab moralistic examples or pieces of wisdom for a better life. We're to see the redemptive work of Christ unfolding through the revelation of God to his people, us, believers in Christ, in the scriptures. Let me provide you with an example of how we often maybe see this done, and then how we kind of give the inverse. Say you're having a hard season in your life, right? You're doing everything right. You're applying yourself to all the proper disciplines, and yet you still continue to find yourself at the short end of the stick. You may be tempted to turn to Job, right? So we go to Job, we get some encouragement about his hardship and how that transpired. Or better yet, let's say we go to Joseph's life. We would focus on the life of Joseph in Genesis chapters 37 through 50. In Joseph, here's what you find. You find a righteous young man who does everything right, and yet finds himself cast into a pit, sold into slavery, and ultimately cast into jail for something he didn't even do. Then he is set free from jail. And how is he set free? Because he has a God-given ability to interpret dreams, which allows him to serve the Pharaoh. And then he has a God-given wisdom to solve massive problems, which avails him the opportunity in the court of Pharaoh to rise to the second in command seat. Now, this is a wonderful story of redemption, right? From a pit to a throne. I mean, the story writes itself. Unfortunately, oftentimes we read this story and we read it and we preach or we find encouragement to simply continue doing the right thing because good things come to those who do the right thing. Is that really the depth of the story? Is that the takeaway, that good things will eventually come to those who do right? That sounds more like karma than grace, doesn't it? It's surely not the goal or surely the takeaway from one of the large looming or one of the biggest Old Testament figures of the Bible. Surely the takeaway of his life story isn't meant to be a karmic story of how good prevails. Let's instead look at the life of Joseph. Let's say we're reading Genesis 37 through 50 with a focus on Jesus. In Joseph, we see a foreshadowing of what is to come in Christ. Jesus himself would also be a preferred son upon whom the Father would lavish goodness, lavish favor. Like Joseph, Jesus would be struck down by those he was to rule over. Yet unlike Joseph, he would be brought back to life he would realize his place upon the throne. You see, while Joseph died and his bones were set aside to be transported back to the promised land some 400 plus years later, Jesus would overcome death to lead his people out of bondage and to the promised land. Jesus would then rule over his people benevolently for all of eternity. You see how we look at the story of Joseph through the lens of Jesus? We see that Joseph's story isn't a karmic story of good that comes to those who do right, but a story that leaves us hoping for a better Redeemer, one who would never die, and one whose provision would never end. This sort of focus on Jesus in our Bible reading draws us to God's intent for all of the scriptures, which is to bring us into his redemptive plan and show us Jesus. One professor named Kelly Kapic said, "What we discover is that amid the many stories of the Bible is an underlying story which leads us to Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us." Reading the Bible with Jesus in focus inherently draws the focus off of ourselves, and it helps us to see Jesus more clearly. So next time, we'll focus on fleshing this out a little more by looking at reading the Bible with the context in mind. But today this week I want our takeaway to be, let us read our Bibles, but let us read our Bibles not with ourselves in view, but with Jesus in focus.